This is our first look at the Cold War. This is one of four PowerPoints looking at the growingly complicated foreign relations situation that existed between the United States and its former World War II ally, the Soviet Union. Now, one of the things that happens very early on is that there is a competition between these two countries. One sees the world that should exist one way, another sees it a very different way. And through a number of very tense events down through almost 4 decades of history, we see America's foreign policy dominated by how it's going to deal with the Soviet Union. This is otherwise known as the Cold War. Immediately following World War II, there is a decision made about what to do with Germany immediately after the war is done and Germany has surrendered. And one of the immediate decisions that is made is that Germany is being divided up into several different zones. Now, the two maps you see here over on the right is Germany as a whole, and then the city of Berlin, which of course was the capital of Germany, is also to be divided up very similarly. And yet Berlin is actually deep inside the area of Germany that would be controlled by the Russians, the Soviets. Now, this map here also indicates how Germany would later be divided up into two countries, with the greenish zones over onto the left to the west being what would eventually become West Germany, and then the red zone you see in there in the east on the right becoming East Germany. And eventually what you have here is a standoff, between these two sides. And the reason for this division was supposedly to prevent Germany from ever being able to carry out war ever again. This is a direct result of what had happened for the last 30 years, where two world wars had been fought over a very militaristic Germany. First, Imperial Germany during World War I, and then, of course, under the Nazi regime during World War II. And Russia, in particular, the Soviet Union, was determined that this would never happen again. And when we look at what ends up happening, Germany actually ends up being a focal point for the Cold War. Berlin, the actual city of Berlin, becomes emblematic. In other words, it's an icon, it's a representation, it's a symbol of the split between the communist East, controlled by the Soviet Union, and the democratically run West. And President Truman, of course, coming in right after FDR passes away, writes a document known as the Truman Doctrine. And essentially what it was designed to do was it was designed to make sure that countries could decide for themselves, as long as they weren't communist, what kind of government they should have. And the reason for that was because the United States feared at this point that if countries became communist countries and adopted a communist economy and government, that they would become allies of the Soviet Union. Now, there are other issues as well. A lot of people will say that the communists were godless. In other words, they were atheists. They suppressed religious freedom. They suppressed various other liberties that are allowed here in the United States, and therefore everybody should enjoy the same freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States. But really, it was a battle of ideologies between the United States and the Soviet Union. Where we first see this is as World War II is ending, there are communist-led revolutions in the countries of both Greece and Turkey. And in both those countries, these revolutions threatened to overthrow the existing governments in those countries. President Truman, as part of the Truman Doctrine, asked for $400 million to be sent to these two countries to support the military effort against these communist revolutions in order to make sure that those two countries did not become communist countries. It was successful. Neither country became a communist country. And so the Truman Doctrine was kind of seen as the beginning of how the United States was going to interact with Soviet-backed communist revolutions around the world. And if you see right there, the very top of the slide, the Truman Doctrine stated that American aid might contain communism within its current borders. That really was the key. It was all about containment. In other words, making sure that if countries that were already communist at the end of World War II, they would remain so. However, no other country would be allowed to become a communist country if the United States had anything to say about it. Now, unfortunately, this set the United States down a path where the United States would spend the next 40-some years intervening in countries around the world where it felt communist revolutions were in danger of making that country, quote-unquote, fall to communism. And that's a term you would often hear. And this referred to something called the domino theory, something we'll hear about later. But if that country falls, it means it becomes a communist country. And that's, of course, opposed to a democratic one. But in reality, it really meant if you fell to communism, it meant you are no longer within the American sphere. In other words, you are no longer a country that was friendly to the United States. It didn't really matter if your country was necessarily a democratic nation, in other words, you elected your own officials or not. It just mattered whether or not you were friendly to the United States, in other words, a non-communist country. And so we also see here the beginning of what was called the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was an effort to try and help rebuild Europe. One of the lessons that had been learned after World War I was that after the war was over, countries needed to be rebuilt. Otherwise, you would create desperate situations that created dictators like Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany. And so what the United States did was they allocated a huge amount of money. In other words, they set aside over $17 billion to help rebuild countries like Great Britain, France, West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy. And as a result, a lot of those countries actually became friendly to the United States. They became allies of the United States. The other thing that it did, though, was it created a very prosperous part of Europe that is still surviving that way today. So the Marshall Plan ended up being very, very, very successful. Now, at the same time, that the Truman Doctrine was being put into play. The Marshall Plan was being carried out. In 1947, Congress passes what's called the NSA, the National Security Act. What this did was it created a number of agencies within the American government. And primarily, they were designed to create an intelligence network in order to spy on other countries to make sure they weren't becoming communist countries. All the highest ranking military chiefs in the country, in other words, your top commanders of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, so on and so forth, they were gathered together in what became now known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You now had what was called the National Security Council, which they were a part of. You also had what was called the Central Intelligence Agency, which became the primary intelligence gathering part of the American government. And they would use this to essentially spy on other countries and other people. This was America's spy network. And it would be the CIA that would end up playing a major part in the events of the Cold War and the ongoing struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is the era, even though we're actually talking about other intelligence agencies, this is the era of James Bond and the KGB and all those things. This is when that all really started to take place. The idea of these wonderful covert actions where, subtle actions meant they were, intelligence was being deposited in secret locations, so on and so forth. And all those wonderful, spy era movies also came out kind of in response to this. Everybody had their spy network. The Soviet Union had what was called the KGB. You had the British MI6, which is where James Bond came out of. And then, of course, you had the American CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. But in a little while here, the Cold War was about to get a little warmer. Now, as we looked at before, Germany had been divided into East and West. Berlin, even though it was divided between East-West, it was still located deep inside the part of Germany controlled by the Soviet Union. And Stalin didn't like that very much. Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union, did not like the fact that essentially the West, led by the United States, had an outpost inside a part of territory they controlled. And so in 1948, Stalin attempted to drive out the Western allies, the British, French, and the Americans, out of Berlin by essentially cutting off the entire city. And they wouldn't allow planes to land in the Berlin airport. They put tanks right in the middle of the tracks to prevent any trains from coming into the city. They cut off the telephone lines. They cut the power. They essentially shut down the whole city and wouldn't allow anybody to leave or come in, with the intention of essentially trying to force out the those in the western part of the city. So it wasn't just the eastern part of the city they were cutting off. They cut off the entire city, both the west and eastern halves. Well, at this point, President Truman has a couple options. He can, decide to fight his way into Berlin, essentially start another war. He can use nuclear weapons. A lot of people thought he should have. Truman decided to use a different option. And instead of directly confronting the Soviet military that was blockading the city, he decided to simply fly over it. And pilots who just a few years ago were dropping bombs on Berlin now were using their planes to drop everything from clothes to food supplies to candy. In fact, there was one guy who was nicknamed the Chocolate Uncle who would drop these little chocolate bars to kids inside Berlin. This was known as the Berlin Airlift. And essentially what it was designed to do was designed to provide for the people inside Berlin while they were being cut off by the Soviet Union. The Soviets realized that what they were doing was ultimately pointless. The Americans were not going to start a war over Berlin, but they were going to continue supplying all their people in Berlin. So if someone was going to have to take a shot, it was going to be the Soviets, and they didn't want to start a war over Berlin either. And so ultimately, Stalin has to stand down, and he opens up the roads back up to Berlin. Round one to the Western Allies. Around the same time, immediately after the Berlin crisis ended, the Western Allies decided to form a military alliance, just in case there was ever a formal attack on one of their nations. And these nations were Great Britain, France, Italy, Canada, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and of course, the United States. And they formed what became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it was essentially a military alliance to defend themselves against possible Soviet aggression. Stalin turned right around and said, you know what, that's an act of war. So we're going to form our own alliance of countries. And this became known as the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact, Warsaw in Poland, it was where it was signed, basically was the Soviet Union and several of its other satellite nations. And this became known as the Soviet bloc. These were countries that the Soviet Union had occupied at the end of World War II. These countries really didn't have much independence. On the surface, it seemed that they did. They had what were called Soviet governments, but you had the Soviet Socialist Republic of Poland. You had the Soviet Socialist Republic of Romania. You had the Soviet Socialist Republic ... fill in the blank. What that really translated into were these governments were under the control of Moscow, under the Soviet Union. They did what the Soviet Union told them to do. And that was the difference between the nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact and those that were part of NATO. NATO, they were all independent, sovereign countries, free to make their own decisions. In the Soviet bloc, not so much. Later that same year, another escalation in the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States occurred when the Soviet Union tested their own first atomic weapon. This proved that the Soviet Union had spies within the United States. It's probably the only way they would ever get this kind of technology. And somewhat later, Truman decided to test their own upgraded bomb, and that was the hydrogen bomb. Within 6 months, the Soviet Union had one too. The hydrogen bomb made the bomb dropped on Hiroshima look like a firecracker. It was literally 100 times stronger. The Cold War finally actually does heat up in an area of the world known as Korea. Korea had been a leftover from World War II. The Soviet Union had controlled the northern part of the Korean peninsula toward the end of the war. The southern part, because of its proximity, its closeness to Japan, was supported by the United States. This eventually developed into a complete division of the area, with North Korea having a communist government supported by the Soviet Union, and the South having a government supported by the United States and the United Nations. And so as a result, you have a division in Korea between North and South. And it's this division that really clearly shows the division between the rest of the world. You were either on the Soviet side or you were on the side of the United States. And one of the interesting things about North Korea, that guy you see up there in the upper right-hand corner, that is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. And yet North Korea is supposed to be just as free as South Korea? I don't think so. But, you know, that's their version of history. The 38th parallel became kind of the imaginary line through which the Korean peninsula was divided in half. And it would be this divide between North and South that would end up leading to a conflict in Korea. Something often referred to as the Forgotten War. But in Korea, you see this divide between North and South, and this is a direct connection to World War II because of where American and Soviet soldiers were stationed. In late 1949, early 1950, President Truman essentially stated that the primary goal of the United States was to defend Western Europe. In other words, Western Berlin, Western Germany, from communist expansion. People often believe that this was kind of a green light to the Soviet Union, who then encouraged their North Korean comrades to invade South Korea, which is exactly what happened. On June 25th, 1950, North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. The United Nations and United States, having supported South Korea, determined that this was a illegal aggression and decided to repel the armed attack in North Korea. The UN sent in troops led by the United States. In fact, the vast majority of the troops in Korea would be the United States, and they were led by the World War II hero of the Pacific Campaign, Douglas MacArthur, who you guys heard of when we looked at World War II. World War II hero and General Douglas MacArthur landed a very large number of troops in a very D-Day type of invasion at a place called Incheon in September of that same year, 1950. The Incheon landing ended up being very, very, very successful because it caught the North Koreans completely off guard. And it actually ended up pushing the North Koreans clear up past the 38th parallel. And this was the point. And that was to not necessarily invade North Korea, but to simply push back the invaders and kick them out of South Korea. And that's what ended up happening. So this is an example of where the Cold War gets hot. But it still is part of the Cold War, because what you have here, the United States may be involved, but the other half of this story, the Soviet Union is not involved, not directly. However, they are supporting one of the sides of the war, and that, of course, is the side of the North Koreans. as well as the Chinese. In 1949, the Chinese had become a communist country and were also now comrades in arms with their fellow communists in the Soviet Union and in North Korea, and continue to be today. Now, once MacArthur had pushed the North Koreans out of South Korea, he continued to push them all the way until they got to a place called the Yalu River. Now, the reason why this is important is because not only had MacArthur pushed the North Koreans out of South Korea, he almost pushed them right out of North Korea. The Yalu River becomes a crucial place because as the Americans approached the Yalu River borders China. And so it looked as though that the Americans or at least the forces of the United Nations weren't only going to remove the threat out of South Korea, out of North Korea, but also potentially out of China. As the Americans approached the Yalu River, over 400,000 Chinese soldiers all of a sudden fled across the border. And now the United States and United Nations forces found themselves going toe-to-toe not only with North Korean soldiers, but also with the Chinese army. And as a result, the battle fights all the way back to the 38th parallel where it had started, the border between North and South Korea. General MacArthur wanted to actually use the atomic bomb and bomb mainland China. He wanted to actually bomb strategic targets in China. Truman feared that if MacArthur was allowed to do that, this would escalate into a full-blown World War III. MacArthur said, okay, so be it. Truman said, The result was Truman fires MacArthur after MacArthur actually publicly criticized his own president in the newspapers. And Truman's like, yeah, you may be the general, but I'm the president of the United States. For the next couple of years, the war basically grinds on very much like World War I had in the trenches. Only here, it was in the freezing cold of the mountains and hills near the border between North and South Korea. The Korean War is often seen as the forgotten war, mainly because the soldiers who fought it were either veterans of World War II or were the younger brothers or sisters of those that had fought in World War II. And when the Korean War is finally brought to a close, no one really wants to have any parades or anything about it. They simply want to forget it. The Americans in the American culture was tired of war. And so when veterans came home from the Korean War after the new president, Eisenhower, negotiated an end to the war, a lot of people simply just forgot about it. And as a result, veterans of the Korean War were often seen as an event that Americans just wanted to forget about. And it's actually quite sad. When I was in middle school, I had a history teacher and an English teacher who both had fought in the Korean War. And it was not necessarily a disgrace that no one wanted to hear about it, but it was just something that no one really wanted to talk about. No one wanted to talk about the Korean War. And there's no really good explanation as to why, outside of the fact that it happened just a little bit too close to World War II. And as a result, after that war, Americans really didn't have any connection with it. A lot of Americans didn't see Korea as a real threat at all. to the United States. And so when the soldiers came home, it was kind of like, thank you for doing your duty. Now let's go back to washing the dishes and getting dinner ready. Um, it was almost like people really just wanted to pretend like it never happened. Unfortunately, at the end of the Korean War, nothing really had been solved. In fact, for the next 50 years, technically the war never ended. Instead, all that happened in 1953, after the new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the hero of World War II, had become president, he went up there and he said, I will go to Korea to end the Korean War. And all that really happens is the shooting stopped. Both sides still remain suspicious of each other. Both sides ended up, still technically at war, even though the shooting had stopped. So at this point, ladies and gentlemen, we're here at the end of our first PowerPoint, taking a look at the political, economic, and social changes that had occurred. Primarily, we're looking at political changes. This was the policy of the United States to fight against communist expansion in various places like in Asia and in Europe, and the efforts that were taken to make sure that that happened, or in some cases didn't happen.